Number 1. The Roman flexible glass. Picture a workshop in Rome, sometime around the year 30 AD. A craftsman has been granted an audience with the Emperor Tiberius. In his hands, he carries a drinking bowl of ordinary-looking glass. He sets it down, and then, to prove a point, he throws it against the stone floor. It does not shatter. It dents, like a cup of bronze. The man calmly picks up a small hammer and taps the dent back out. The glass is whole again. This is the story of vitrum flexile, flexible glass, the unbreakable glass of Rome. 3 separate ancient writers tell it. Petronius records it in his Satyricon around the year 60 AD. Pliny the Elder repeats it in his Natural History about 77 AD. Cassius Dio tells it again a century later. In every version, the ending is the same, and it is chilling. Tiberius asks the inventor a single question. Does anyone else know how to make this? The man swears that he alone holds the secret. So the emperor has him executed and orders his workshop destroyed. The logic, according to Pliny, was economic. If glass could be made unbreakable, then gold and silver would lose their value. A material this good was a threat to the entire monetary order of the empire. Now, this happened in a world where glass was already cheap. The invention of glass blowing, around 50 BC on the Syro-Judean coast, had turned glass from a luxury into an everyday product. Roman glass was a soda-lime-silica mixture, using a mineral flux called natron carried from the Egyptian desert. Modern chemists are deeply skeptical that any ancient recipe could produce glass that bends at room temperature. The chemistry simply does not allow it. And yet the detail that it dented rather than broke is oddly specific, the kind of thing a witness might actually describe. Whatever the truth, the story survived. Isidore of Seville was still repeating it in the 7th century, and modern history has produced strange echoes. In 2012, the Corning Company unveiled a bendable product it called Willow Glass. We now have flexible glass, and the world did not collapse. What makes this the perfect place to begin is the mechanism of loss. No physical example of vitrum flexile has ever been found. If the tale is true, then a single execution erased an entire technology from human memory. Trade secrets in the ancient world were not protected by patents. They were protected and sometimes destroyed by the sword. Which raises a question. If one death could bury an invention forever, how many others vanished the same way? Number 2. Greek fire. Some secrets are guarded so tightly that they die. Greek fire is the greatest example in history. Around the year 672 AD, a Byzantine weapon appeared that could burn on the surface of water. According to the chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, it was delivered to Constantinople by a Greek-speaking refugee named Kallinikos from Heliopolis in Roman Syria. It arrived at exactly the right moment. Arab fleets were besieging the Byzantine capital, first between 674 and 678 AD, and again between 717 and 718. Both times, Greek fire helped destroy them. The weapon worked through a pressurized bronze tube called a siphon, mounted on the prow of a warship. It sprayed a burning liquid across the sea and onto enemy vessels. There were even handheld versions, called kyrosophones. The defining property was terror itself. The fire kept burning on water. It could not be put out with water. The sources say it took sand, strong vinegar, or old urine to smother it. The Byzantines understood exactly what they had. In a document written for his son around 950 AD, the Emperor Constantine VII described Greek fire as a gift from God, a state secret that must never, under any circumstances, be shared with foreigners. And here's the crucial point. The knowledge was compartmentalized. The people who mixed the chemicals may not have been the people who built the pumps, who may not have been the people who aimed the siphons. No single person held the whole process. Modern researchers believe the fuel was petroleum, crude naphtha seeping from the shores of the Black Sea and the Caucasus, thickened with pine resin and sulfur, perhaps triggered by quicklime. The historian John Halden actually built a working bronze siphon in a series of experiments in the early 2000s and proved that a petroleum flame projector was entirely feasible. The engineering, the preheated pressurized chamber, and the force pump may have been the real secret, even more than the chemistry. Greek fire helped the Byzantine Empire survive for centuries. Many historians argue the defense of 718 shielded all of Europe from the advancing Umayyad Caliphate. But the secrecy that made it powerful also doomed it. When the institutions that guarded the formula collapsed, the knowledge went with them. No complete recipe survives. To this day, chemists argue about how it was made. It is the purest case of a technology suppressed into oblivion, real, devastating, and gone. Some lost inventions leave no trace at all, but others left something we can still pick up and hold. Number 3. The Ulfberht sword. Scattered across northern Europe are around 170 swords that should not exist. Each one carries the same strange inscription, inlaid into the blade in bold letters, plus VLFBERH plus T. They were made between the years 800 and 1000 AD, in the age of the Vikings, and their steel is centuries ahead of its time. Ordinary blades of that era were made from bloomery iron, full of slag and impurities, soft and brittle. The Ulfberht blades are made of crucible steel, with a carbon content of roughly 1 to 1.2%, and almost no slag at all. This is nearly the quality of modern steel. The metallurgist Alan Williams, of the Wallace Collection in London, analyzed these swords and found purity that European furnaces of the time simply could not achieve. To make steel like this, you need to fully liquefy iron, which requires temperatures near 1600 degrees Celsius, about 2900 degrees Fahrenheit. Early medieval European forges did not reach that. So, where did the steel come from? The answer is trade. The raw material was almost certainly crucible steel ingots, imported from Central Asia and the Islamic world along the Volga River route, then forged into blades by Frankish smiths. The name Ulfberht was a brand, probably a workshop in the Rhineland, that operated across generations. And like any valuable brand, it was counterfeited. Archaeologists have found cheaper, lower carbon imitations with the letters misspelled or the cross in the wrong place. Fakes made to cash in on a famous name. There is a darker layer to this story, and it belongs in this video. The Frankish state, under Charlemagne, banned the export of swords and weapons to the Vikings. Royal decrees in the years 800, 3 and 811 forbade it outright. Arming raiders with superior blades was considered far too dangerous, so the trade in these weapons was, in part, illegal. Then the technology vanished. In the 11th century, the Volga trade route collapsed. The supply of high-carbon ingots dried up, and because the knowledge was tacit, held in the hands and furnaces of individual smiths rather than written down, it simply disappeared. Europe would not reliably produce crucible steel again until Benjamin Huntsman reinvented the process in the 1740s, 700 years later. In 2012, a documentary followed the modern bladesmith Richard Furrer as he tried to reproduce an Ulfberht blade from scratch. It took extraordinary skill and control, and even experts fail often. A single broken trade link had switched off an advanced technology across an entire continent. Sometimes, though, an invention was not banned or lost. It was simply ignored. Number 4. The steam engine of Hero of Alexandria. In the 1st century AD, a Greek engineer in Egypt built a working steam engine. Then, the world shrugged and put it on a shelf for 1700 years. His name was Hero of Alexandria, and we can date him precisely to around the year 62 AD because he recorded a lunar eclipse. His steam device was called the Aeolipoli. It was a hollow bronze sphere with two bent nozzles mounted above a boiler. When the water boiled, steam shot from the nozzles and the sphere spun. It was the first machine in history to turn steam pressure into spinning motion. He described it in his book, The Pneumatica. But here is the tragedy. The Aeolipol did no useful work. It powered nothing. It was a curiosity, a demonstration, a toy. Hero was no fool, though. He was one of the most inventive minds of the ancient world. He built the first vending machine, a device where you dropped in a coin and it dispensed a measured amount of holy water. He built temple doors that opened by themselves when a fire was lit on the altar, using heated air to move hidden weights of water, an engineered miracle to awe worshippers. In his book on automata, he described programmable puppet theaters, driven by falling weights and ropes wound around pegged drums, an early form of mechanical programming. He even built a wind wheel that powered a machine, the first device to harness the wind that way. So, why did the steam engine go nowhere? The answer is not a ban. It is economics. The ancient Mediterranean ran on slave labor. Human muscle was abundant and cheap. There was no incentive to build a machine that saved labor, because labor was the one thing no one needed to save. The classicist Moses Finley argued exactly this. The elite had no reason to mechanize. There was also a technical gap. Hero's boilers were low pressure. The metallurgy needed to contain powerful steam did not exist. And the crucial idea he lacked was the piston and cylinder, the part that captures steam as pushing force. It would take until Thomas Newcomen in 1712 for a steam engine to finally do real work, pumping water out of mines. Hero's ideas did not entirely die. They were preserved through Arabic translations, and the Banu Musa brothers in 9th century Baghdad built directly on his designs. But the raw power of steam sat unused for the better part of 2 millennia. It is proof that a society can bury an invention as completely as any emperor, simply by not caring. Other inventions, though, were locked down on purpose, because their power was obvious to everyone. Number 5. The Chinese fire lance. The most consequential weapon in human history began as a search for immortality. In the 9th century AD, Chinese alchemists of the Tang dynasty were mixing substances trying to brew an elixir of eternal life. Instead, they discovered gunpowder. They called it huoyao, fire medicine. The earliest surviving formula appears in a military manual called the Wujing Zongyao, compiled in the year 1044 AD under the Song dynasty. And from gunpowder came the ancestor of every gun. It was the fire lance. At its simplest, a fire lance was a tube, first of bamboo, later of metal, packed with gunpowder and strapped to the end of a spear. When lit, it sprayed a jet of flame, sparks, and shrapnel at close range. The oldest known image of one is painted on a silk banner from the Mogao caves at Dunhuang, dating to around the 10th century. It shows a demon holding a fire lance. The Song government understood immediately how dangerous this was, and tried to keep it secret. In the year 1067 AD, an imperial edict banned the private trade of sulfur and saltpeter, the two key ingredients of gunpowder. The goal was to keep the technology out of the hands of the rival Liao and Jin states to the north. Saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, is the oxidizer that makes gunpowder burn. Control the saltpeter, and you control the weapon. Over time, the recipe evolved. Early mixtures were low in nitrate and mostly incendiary. Later ones pushed the nitrate content towards 75%, the ratio that makes gunpowder a true explosive propellant. That shift, measurable in the recorded formulas, turned the fire lance into the hand cannon. The oldest surviving hand cannon, a bronze piece found in Heilongjiang, dates to the year 1288 AD. The Chinese also built terrifying bombs, cast iron shells packed with powder, called heaven-shaking thunder, used in the sieges of the early 1200s. The great scholar of this history is Joseph Needham, whose work documents the entire epic. In the end, the secrecy failed completely. The Mongols swept across China, captured its engineers, and carried gunpowder west across all of Eurasia within decades. A ban meant to contain a weapon instead watched it conquer the world. But some weapons were banned for the opposite reason. Not because they were too secret, but because they made killing far too easy. Number 6. The repeating crossbow. Imagine a weapon that let a single soldier fire 10 bolts in 15 seconds, more than 2,000 years before the machine gun. That weapon existed. It was the Chinese repeating crossbow, the Lian Nu, often called the Zhuge Nu after the famous strategist Zhuge Liang, who lived from 181 to 234 AD. But the design is far older than him. Archaeologists excavated a repeating crossbow from a tomb of the Chu state at Qinjiazui, in Hubei, dating to the 4th century BC. The genius of the weapon was its mechanism. On top of the stock sat a magazine box holding around 10 bolts, stacked vertically. When the archer pushed a lever forward and back, one motion dropped a bolt onto the rail, drew the string, and released it. Push, release, push, release. No pausing to reload. One person could pour out a continuous stream of bolts, but there was a trade-off. To make it fire fast, the draw weight had to be low, and the bolts were short. That meant limited range and weak penetration. The solution was chilling. The bolts were often dipped in poison, usually aconite, also called wolfsbane. Penetration no longer mattered. A single scratch could kill. This made the repeating crossbow a defensive weapon of terrifying efficiency. It was simple enough that minimally trained people could use it, including civilians and women defending a town wall. And that points to a fear that runs through this whole video. Weapons like this erase the advantage of training and status. A peasant with a repeating crossbow could kill a trained warrior. The design was so effective that it stayed in service for an astonishing span of time. Chinese soldiers were still using repeating crossbows as late as the First Sino-Japanese War, between 1894 and 1895. That is a service life of well over 2,000 years, almost unmatched by any weapon in history. The Ming Dynasty Military Encyclopedia, the Wubei Ji, printed in 1621, illustrates the weapon in careful detail. Modern reconstructions confirm the rate of fire really was about 10 bolts in 15 seconds. It was, in effect, area denial, a storm of poisoned bolts that no attacker wanted to walk into. The same anxiety that surrounded this weapon, the fear of making killing too easy, would echo on the other side of the world. There, an institution tried to ban a weapon not by hiding it, but by outlawing knowledge itself. Number 7. Alchemy and the ban on making gold. For nearly 2,000 years, the dream of turning lead into gold was not just a fantasy. It was, at times, a crime. Alchemy began in earnest in Greco-Egyptian Alexandria between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Its central goal was chrysopoeia, the transmutation of base metals into gold, and rulers were afraid of it. Around the years 292 to 296 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian is said to have ordered the burning of Egyptian books on the chemistry of gold and silver. The account comes from a later encyclopedia called the Suda. The motive was control. Egypt had just risen in revolt, and the fear was that people who could manufacture wealth could fund rebellion and wreck the value of money. It is one of the earliest recorded state book burnings aimed squarely at a technology. Alchemy did not die. It moved east into the Islamic world, where the great scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan systematized it in the 8th century, giving us words we still use, like alkali, alembic, and alcohol. Much of the practical apparatus of chemistry was born here. The gentle heating device we still call a bain-marie, a water bath, is named after Maria the Jewess, an alchemist of early Alexandria who invented distillation equipment. But the fear of alchemy followed it into medieval Europe, now tangled up with the crime of counterfeiting coins. In the year 1404 AD, King Henry IV of England passed a statute with a Latin name meaning on the multiplying of gold and silver. It made the act of multiplying gold a felony. The purpose was to protect the coinage from debasement and fraud. Nearly a century earlier, in 1317, Pope John XXII had issued a decree condemning alchemists who promised gold they could never deliver. That English law against making gold stayed on the books until the year 1689, when it was finally repealed, partly through the lobbying of the scientist Robert Boyle, who genuinely hoped transmutation might be real. He was not alone. Isaac Newton spent years on secret alchemical experiments, work so embarrassing to later generations that his manuscripts were hidden away for centuries. And here is the twist that history loves. Transmutation is actually possible. It just requires nuclear reactions, not chemistry. In 1980, the scientist Glenn Seaborg used a particle accelerator to turn a tiny amount of bismuth into gold. The alchemists were chasing something real through the wrong door. Some inventors, though, were never banned by law. Their machines were simply so feared that an enemy tried to erase them in war. Number 8. The war machines of Archimedes. When Rome came for the city of Syracuse, one man held them off almost single-handedly, using machines so frightening that hardened soldiers fled at the sight of a rope. That man was Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of the ancient world, who lived from about 287 to 212 BC. When Rome besieged his home city of Syracuse, between 213 and 212 BC, Archimedes turned his genius to war. We know about his machines from 3 ancient historians, Polybius, Livy, and Plutarch. Polybius wrote within a generation of the siege, so he is the most reliable. The most famous device was the claw of Archimedes, sometimes called the Iron Hand. It was a giant crane fitted with a grappling hook. When a Roman ship drew close to the seawall, the claw would drop, seize the prow, and then lift the front of the ship clean out of the water before letting it drop or capsizing it entirely. The principle behind it was leverage. Archimedes had reportedly demonstrated that with enough pulleys, a single man could move a fully loaded ship. The claw put that principle to lethal use. The Roman commander was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, and according to Plutarch, his men became so terrified that if they merely saw a rope or a wooden beam appear over the wall, they would turn and run, convinced another machine was aimed at them. That is psychological warfare, and it may have been as powerful as the machines themselves. Then, there is the most debated invention of all, the burning mirrors. Later sources claim Archimedes arranged polished mirrors to focus sunlight into a beam that set Roman ships on fire, an ancient heat ray. But the earliest and most reliable sources do not mention it at all. It appears only centuries later, which is why most historians think it was a legend. In 2005, a group at MIT tested the idea with over 100 mirrors and did manage to ignite a mock ship, but only under perfect conditions, and after several minutes, hardly practical in battle. In the end, the machines could not save the city. Syracuse fell in 212 BC, breached during a festival. Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier, despite Marcellus ordering that his life be spared. Legend says his final words were a plea not to disturb his geometry. His war machines were never copied or systematized. They died with him. But one ancient writer, Cicero, mentions something else Archimedes built, a device that hints at something even more astonishing, a machine that would one day be pulled from the sea. Number 9. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working off the tiny island of Antikythera found a Roman-era shipwreck lying about 45 meters down. Among the statues and amphorae they hauled up was a corroded lump of bronze. It sat, largely ignored, until scholars realized what it was. It is the most sophisticated object surviving from the ancient world, and it rewrites what we thought the Greeks could do. It is now called the Antikythera mechanism, and it is nothing less than an analog computer. Built sometime around 100 to 150 BC, it modeled the movements of the sun, the moon, and almost certainly the planets, and it could predict eclipses. The ship that carried it sank around 70 to 60 BC. Inside a wooden case about the size of a shoebox, roughly 34 by 18 by 9 centimeters, sat a system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears. The largest gear has 223 teeth, and that number is not random. It encodes the Saros cycle, a Babylonian eclipse pattern of 223 lunar months. The first serious study came from the Yale historian Derek de Solla Price, whose 1974 paper was titled Gears from the Greeks. But the real breakthrough came later, when researchers used three-dimensional X-ray scanning from 2005 onward to see inside the corroded fragments and read the tiny Greek inscriptions hidden within. What they found was staggering. The device used a pin-and-slot mechanism to model the moon's changing speed across the sky, capturing a subtle astronomical theory developed by the astronomer Hipparchus. On the front was a dial showing the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar. On the back were spiraling dials tracking the Metonic calendar of 19 years, the Saros eclipse cycle, and even the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, naming specific festivals like Nemea and Olympia. The engineer Michael Wright built working reconstructions that prove the gearing actually functions. To cut all those triangular teeth by hand, in exact counts, required a level of craftsmanship that then vanished. Here's the part that stops you cold. Nothing this complex appears again anywhere in the world for roughly 1,400 years, until the great astronomical clocks of medieval Europe in the 14th century. It was knowledge so advanced that when it was lost, there was nothing to replace it. Cicero, writing in this same era, mentioned similar devices built by Archimedes, which suggests a small, brilliant tradition of such machines existed, and then died out almost without a trace. The last invention on our list was not lost to secrecy or genius. It was banned, in writing, by the church itself. Number 10. The crossbow banned by the Second Lateran Council. In the year 1139 AD, the most powerful institution in Europe declared a weapon too dangerous to exist. Pope Innocent II convened the Second Lateran Council in Rome, and among its rulings was Canon 29. It condemned what it called the deadly and God-hated art of crossbowmen and archers, and forbade the use of the crossbow against Christians. There was a loophole. Using the crossbow against non-Christians, in the Crusades, for example, was perfectly acceptable. The ban was about who you killed, not the weapon itself. So why single out the crossbow? The answer cuts to the heart of medieval society. A knight was the product of a lifetime of training, an enormous expense, armor, horses, weapons, years of practice. He sat at the top of the social order. But a crossbow could be handed to an untrained peasant, who, after an afternoon of instruction, could put a bolt straight through that knight from a safe distance. The crossbow did not just kill. It erased the value of noble birth and training. That was the true danger. The weapon was fearsome in its own right. Medieval crossbows used steel or composite bows with draw weights reaching into the hundreds of pounds, and the heaviest, spanned with a crank called a windlass, could exceed 1,000 pounds of force. A heavy bolt, called a quarrel, could punch through chainmail and even early plate armor at close range. To load these monsters, soldiers developed a whole family of devices: the belt hook, the goat's foot lever, the rack and pinion cranaquin, and the windlass. The ban, of course, failed completely. The crossbow was simply too useful. It remained a central weapon of European warfare for centuries. Elite Genoese crossbowmen were prized mercenaries, famously present at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. History even served up a grim irony. King Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, was a great champion of the crossbow. In 1199, he was killed by a crossbow bolt at the siege of Chalus. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, writing in the same century, called the crossbow a truly diabolical weapon. The Church's ruling is one of the earliest recorded attempts at arms control, an authority looking at a new technology and declaring it must not be allowed. And like almost every such attempt, it was ignored, because the people who fight wars will always choose the weapon that wins. 10 inventions, and a single pattern runs through all of them. Who really gets to decide what is too dangerous to exist? Look back across these 10 stories, and the reasons behind each ban start to rhyme. There are really only 3. The first is economic threat. Flexible glass and alchemical gold were both feared because they attacked the value of money itself. An emperor who could not control the supply of precious things could not control his empire. The second reason is military secrecy. Greek fire, gunpowder, and the Ulfberht steel trade were all guarded or restricted to keep a decisive advantage out of enemy hands. The third reason is social anxiety. The fear of a weapon that erases rank. Both crossbows, Chinese and European, terrified elites because they let the weak kill the strong, regardless of training or birth. But there is a fourth kind of suppression that wore no official face at all. It was neglect. Hero's steam engine and the Antikythera mechanism were never banned by anyone. They were simply not valued enough to be carried forward, and so they slipped out of the world. And running beneath all of it is a darker mechanism still: death. The glassmaker was executed. Archimedes was cut down. Knowledge that lived in a single mind or a single workshop was only ever one funeral away from extinction. Notice how often the reason given was protection, and how often that protection destroyed the very thing it guarded. Greek fire was kept so secret that it died. The openly outlawed crossbow, by contrast, survived for 1,000 years. When you look closely, too dangerous almost always meant dangerous to someone in power. That leads to a harder question. How does a technology actually disappear? The uncomfortable truth is that most ancient knowledge was never written down. It lived in bodies and in workshops. A master smith knew the exact color of hot steel, the precise timing of a quench, the feel of the metal under the hammer. This is tacit knowledge, and it cannot be copied from a book. It has to be taught, hand to hand, one generation to the next. Break that chain, and the knowledge is simply gone. That is why a single execution could end the story of flexible glass. It is why the loss of the Volga trade route switched off Ulfberht steel across a continent. No ingots meant no blades, and the smiths who knew what to do with them had nothing to work with. Greek fire shows a different failure. Its knowledge was deliberately split among many people so that no one held the whole secret. That protected it from spies, but it also meant that when the institutions collapsed, the pieces could never be reassembled. War is another eraser. When the Mongols captured Chinese engineers, the technology did not just spread, it was torn from its home. And then there is time itself. Bronze corrodes to a crumbling green crust. Iron rusts to nothing. Papyrus rots. The Antikythera mechanism survived only by the pure accident of a shipwreck, sealed away from the air for 2,000 years. Some knowledge did claw its way back. Crucible steel returned in the 1740s, but some, like the exact recipe for Greek fire, never did. Every one of these losses shares a root cause: fragility, too few makers, too few copies, too much secrecy. The circle of people who knew was always too small. Which is exactly why modern researchers have had to become detectives, reverse engineering the past from scraps. Recovering these lost inventions is a science of its own, and it is astonishing what it can do. Take the Antikythera mechanism. For decades, it was an unreadable lump. Then researchers turned three-dimensional X-ray scanning on it and read inscriptions that had been hidden inside the corrosion for 2 millennia, counting individual gear teeth to reconstruct exactly what the machine calculated. For the Ulfberht swords, the metallurgist Alan Williams put samples under the microscope and measured their carbon content, proving the steel was far purer than anything Europe should have made. For Greek fire, the historian John Halden took a different path. He built one. His team constructed a working bronze siphon and demonstrated that a pressurized petroleum weapon really could throw fire across water. This is experimental archaeology, learning by rebuilding. The bladesmith Richard Furrer forged crucible steel by hand to feel exactly how hard it was to make an Ulfberht. Engineers built working models of the Antikythera gears to confirm they mesh and turn correctly. Even the wild claims get tested. When students at MIT aimed over 100 mirrors at a mock ship to test Archimedes' heat ray, they were doing real science, and their honest result, that it barely works, is as valuable as a success. Sometimes the modern world catches up by accident. When Corning unveiled bendable glass, it was an unintentional echo of the Roman legend. When Glenn Seaborg turned bismuth into gold with a particle accelerator, he accidentally fulfilled the alchemist's dream. The tools are powerful: texts, artifacts, chemistry, and physical experiment, all working together. And yet, for all this ingenuity, some doors remain firmly shut. Honesty demands that we admit how much is still beyond our reach. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown. We have good candidates: petroleum, resin, sulfur, quicklime, but no surviving recipe, and chemists still argue over the details. We do not know whether Roman flexible glass was ever real, or whether it was a dramatic exaggeration of some lesser discovery. We cannot say for certain whether Archimedes' burning mirrors were ever used in a real battle, or whether that beam of fire existed only in the imagination of later writers. The Antikythera mechanism, even after all our scanning, is still not fully understood. The precise gearing that tracked the planets is partly reconstructed and partly educated guesswork. And these are only the inventions we know about. How many others were suppressed so early, so completely, that they left no record at all? The books Diocletian burned in Alexandria are simply gone, their contents lost forever. We study only the tiny fraction of the past that happened to survive, the objects that dodged the rust, the fire, and the melting pot. This is the great trap of history: survivorship. We see what lasted, and we forget that it may be the least representative sliver of what once existed. Somewhere on the seafloor, there may be other geared computers waiting to be found. In the memory of vanished workshops, there were skills no living person can now reproduce. The scale of what we have lost is, by its very nature, unknowable. Which brings us, finally, back to the phrase that started all of this: too dangerous. So what is the verdict on the idea of an invention being too dangerous to exist? Across every story here, the phrase meant something specific. Too dangerous almost never meant dangerous to humanity. It meant dangerous to profit, to power, or to the social order. The emperor feared for the value of his gold. The pope feared for the supremacy of his knights. The song court feared for its military edge. In each case, the danger was to someone at the top, and the attempts to contain it almost always failed. The crossbow was banned and thrived. Gunpowder was restricted and conquered the world. Bans on useful technology, from 1139 to the present day, have a remarkably poor track record. The far more effective destroyer was never a law at all. It was neglect, and the quiet snapping of the thread that carries knowledge from one person to the next. That is the real lesson hidden in these 10 inventions. Knowledge is not a possession that stays safe once discovered. It is more like a fire, easily snuffed out, and surprisingly hard to relight. A secret guarded too well can die with its keeper. A machine ignored for a few centuries can be forgotten as though it never was. Every time archaeologists pull another impossible object from the earth or the sea, we are reminded that advanced and ancient were never opposites, and that the human capacity for genius is far older than we like to admit. The question these stories leave behind is not really about the past. It is about who gets to decide what should exist, and whether anyone ever truly can. The next time you hear that something has been lost to history, it is worth asking a harder question. Was it lost, or was it taken?